Hi, and welcome back to Plan9Crunch. I'm Joe Gibson, and today I will be reviewing the Kharis Tetralogy from Universal Pictures, released between 1940 and 44. If you would prefer this in written form, links will be in the description. In The Mummy's Hand from 1940, Universal's mummy archetype changed from Boris Karloff's Imhotep to Tom Tyler's, and eventually Lon Jr.'s Kharis. So I have this Legacy Collection, a DVD, which has the Boris Karloff mummy, and then the Kharis movies we're discussing today. So, with this cosmetic change of Imhotep to Kharis, also came a period of the most consistent and yet also experimental of the Universal Monster series. Well, Dracula, the succession of Universal werewolf films, and the Invisible Man sequels meandered into disconnected anthology, and the Frankenstein series that makes up the bulk of the franchise's narrative swapped protagonist monsters halfway to the Wolfman. This tetralogy remains focused on the saga of Kharis, even if it makes some very odd and ill-advised decisions to navigate us through that story. Before we proceed into analyzing this film, it is important to pin down what genres this and the following films are aiming for, focused more on quirky characters on an expedition. The Mummy's Hand does not fit cleanly into the gothic horror model one expects from Universal's earlier works, especially Dracula 1931, where consistent application of tension, whether or not each scene ends in a major release, occurs throughout the film. This film, to some critics' chagrin, does not feature much terror or suspense until the very end of the film, when it would structurally make sense to have tension in any film of any genre that still has some horror elements. The original Mummy film with Boris Karloff borrowed a lot from Dracula, so the comparison is a pretty easy way to rule out that authorial intent if this new film is so different. Horror comedy is an option, of course, as character Babe Jensen comes off similarly to the Costello role in later movies, while the Mummy's hunts for his tana leaves are genuinely suspenseful. But much of the film seems focused on the adventure to find funding and navigate the temple. The Brendan Fraser Mummy films oriented closer to adventure with horror elements, so I see no issue with a Mummy movie being labeled adventure over horror if that reflects the priorities of the film. That would make this film somewhat more slipstream by comparison, since Brendan Fraser's Mummy leans more into swashbuckling and has more runtime to spend on adventure set pieces. As should be obvious, The Mummy's Tomb, the next Kharis film, is decidedly not an adventure movie. For what it is worth, I will label that film a proto-slasher and highlight the shared tropes I see when we get there. And films 3 and 4 are a bit more complicated, as you'll see. This shows off a flexibility of genre for the Kharis films despite very similar plots and the often experimental nature. Any more specifics into the differences in genre intent between these first two movies will probably have to extend to the differences between directors Christy Caban and Harold Young, which is a comparison I am not yet qualified to make. Based on what we can observe in each film, however, I believe my speculation into genre to be mostly accurate. One of the most frequent jokes, and honestly at this point meme, about the Kharis tetralogy is that based on context clues, the dating of the series is such that The Mummy's Hand takes place in the 1940s, with an immediate 30-year time skip, after which point World War II is still happening? And by the end of this series, it is the mid to late 90s without much difference in the way the world is portrayed. Because I cannot weigh in on the clothing, speech patterns, or technology of the different decades, let me say that Babe's pop culture references to the Coney Island hot dogs, origin 1867 to 1867 to 1871, P.T. Barnum, died 1891, and Pig Latin, which originated as Dog Latin in 1598, became Hog Latin in 1866, and sometime in the 1800s or 1900s became Pig Latin. Those in The Mummy's Hand, those references, are reasonable for any time frame in an early to mid-1900s based on cursory research. Frank Dello Stritto, in the postscript for his scholarly historical fiction book The Passion of the Mummy, said that there is one brief mention of the May 1940 date of Banning and Solvani's partnership, which Dello Stritto highlights as an unlikely and unrealistic time frame for those kinds of pursuits. Given that the film started shooting in May 1940, I see no reason we cannot regard this similarly to mistaken clocks in old films more accurate to the shooting time than the film's actual setting time. Thus, I will not mention the dates, except that it is entirely possible that the mummy's tomb might instead be in the 1940s, because of World War II, making the timeline slightly better. Alright, now into The Mummy's Hand. The film begins with efficient introductions to three of the leads. Andoheb, by George Zucco, the villain who begins the film with a promotion from lay priest to new high priest after his mentor, the previous high priest, reveals Kharis' backstory to him. We also meet Steve Banning, a charismatic but impulsive, accomplished researcher that spends their remaining money on an ancient vase, and his best friend and companion, Babe Jensen, the comic relief character that buys a dancing doll at the same market because of their differences. Steve and Babe circumvent a lot of the issues with their archetypal pairing because the film allows for brief moments of comedic weakness in Steve. Marta pulling Steve out of another wild mummy chase at the end of the film, and surprising seriousness from Babe, what he does to Andoheb at the end. While still feeling like the same characters scene to scene, Andoheb meanwhile comes off as a convincing manipulator since, due to the mummy's late arrival into the action, his manipulations of Marta, Petrie, and through the beggar as a secondary antagonist are the main antagonistic obstacles. Much of this success is due to the casting of George Zucco as Andoheb, Dick Foran as Steve, and Wallace Ford as Babe. As far as early symbols and foreshadowing thematic content, navigating the stairs outside the temple of the High Priest of Karnak, as their cult is called, could be significant, since one of the first things Andoheb does is climb those outside stairs on the way to greater power, and the last thing he does in this film is fall down those stairs when Babe and Steve take away that power with a gun. Implicitly, Andoheb causes the rock slide that uncovers Kharis' tomb from a place of higher standing, which also matches his attempted manipulation of Petrie through being a man of higher standing in the museum. This does not map through every scene or every instance of a staircase, however. More significant to this conversation is the opening words of the film as spoken by the previous High Priest of Karnak. For who shall defile the temples of the ancient gods? A cruel and violent death shall be his fate, and never shall his soul rest unto eternity. Such is the curse of Amun-Ra, king of all the gods. The seal of 7 jackals on the tomb reinforces this message, clarifying death to whoever breaks the seal. And this does happen. It is one of the few achievements the film allows to Dr. Petrie, rather than divvying them up to Steve or Marta. More on that later, because the film seems to think that the person who broke that seal should die, which raises interesting questions about the morality of this whole situation. Kharis' curse happens because of the very human desire to be with his lover after death, and the High Priests manipulate him as a servant, but do so from a place of authority under implicitly real gods. So what makes Andoheb the villain of this movie is protecting that secret. But the way he does it seems to break the rules outlined by his mentor, which seems to be the reason he fails, not the pursuit itself. We'll see more on this as it develops throughout the Tetralogy. Steve has an understandable motivation, genuine passion for archaeology, and why not profit along the way, but he comes off as obsessive and reckless in a few key scenes. Dr. Petrie, an actual employee at the Cairo Museum, disregards his boss, incidentally Andoheb, to join Steve's wild hunt for Ananka's tomb, Ananka being the female mummy, and lover of Kharis, that could likely end in the death of them. Steve and Babe are fast friends with their financier, magician Solvani, but their early scenes do seem like them playing each other in genuinely friendly ways that have consequences because the way Steve is conducting this whole operation resembles a scam. Make it easier for Andoheb to convince Marta, Solvani's daughter, that it is. Not taking into account the sequel, this film thinks that Steve, Babe, Marta, and Solvani, at least, are innocent of any specific wrongdoing because Andoheb's assistant, the beggar, is viewed as wrong for disliking Babe early on, and does meet his death carrying out the will of the gods against these characters. Petrie and Ali not being as lucky as our core 4. One could make a case that Marta is the redeeming factor for Steve and Solvani, since she does not want to take part in this expedition but takes responsibility, steps up, and does the best at deciphering the secrets at the end, preventing Steve from going on another one of these, and just being the voice of reason for Father Solvani. But I guess the instant comedic karma of Babe's bits must be enough to balance his moral scales, at least. Solvani, real name Tim Sullivan, as played by Cecil Kellaway, is an interesting character in this film. While Babe is the kind of comedic character that is so against his own volition, Magician Solvani keeps in good spirits and directly steers into every joke, at his expense. There comes a moment in the film while Sylvani is drunk, with Marta trying to convince him not to go on the expedition. And despite still wanting to go, Sylvani cannot resist the funniest outcomes possible, even if they are against his self-interest, continually cycling through his magic bits and locking himself in a box. This is a very unique type of character that would not tonally meld with a clear-cut gothic horror. Despite great focus early on, he is mostly a vehicle to introduce Marta to Steve. Charles Trowbridge plays Dr. Petrie, a somewhat confusing character for reasons I've previously alluded to, but we'll get more into now. He is the only one of the expedition actually enrolled at the nearby museum, but he acts the least professionally, immediately breaking the seal and failing to notice that the mummy whose skin he examines is still alive. So they're looking for Ananka. They find Kharis because the layout is more complicated than they expected, and Kharis is still alive because he's been kept alive by the Tonalees. You know this already if you watched the movie. Petrie also, surprisingly enough, has undeniable similarities to Marta in such a way that I wonder if the comparison was even intended, but we can follow it through. Like Marta, he starts the film with an older authority figure it is in his better interest to stay with, but gravitates towards Steve upon their meeting. Dr. Petrie's introduction sees him choosing the young and untested Steve over the higher credibility of Andoheb, declaring the vase a fake. There is a vase that is important to this. While Marta is fully determined to take Sylvani away from Steve and Babe until she sees Steve and decides to come along. Now yes, I know that the contexts are different in ways that speak to their individual character traits, and Steve is seductive to them for different reasons. Here the characters are actually foils. Since the context is almost completely reversed, since Petrie is the ostensible expert that acts immaturely up to his death, well, Marta is the magician's daughter who turns out to be the most responsible character, at which point the story rewards her with Petrie's skills and knowledge. I say this because after Petrie dies, the film proceeds as if his previous contributions and observations of the tomb were Marta's. Like, legitimately. She brings them back up to Steve and is the closest to figuring everything out until the end of the film. Just because I can see what they were doing with these characters does not mean I think it's justified, though. The adjustments that happen to Marta's character do not feel earned, but do make this movie more contrived than it needed to be. If Marta were interested in Egyptology from the start, she would have joined the expedition for different reasons than protecting her father and attraction to Steve. That abrupt attraction to Steve at least has some justification due to juxtaposing his and Babe's appearances. But it is still convenient. I should clarify that. She thinks that Steve is Babe at one point, if I recall correctly. If she lacked the skills to interpret hieroglyphics, then the movie could not proceed, and if Andoheb did not happen to develop feelings for her, then again, the movie does not happen this way. That said, Peggy Moran does a great job in the role, and her chemistry with the rest of the cast does not seem out of place. If you just sit down and watch the movie, you will not question when she starts talking to Steve about the tomb, because it is just our romantic lead sharing the scene. I did not consider it for a long time. It took the most recent rewatches. Their relationship is entirely serviceable. I think The Mummy's Tomb does such a good job fleshing out what the loss of Marta means to Steve's life that it makes one retroactively view their relationship as stronger than the movie that featured it. But their relationship in this film, well rushed and a little convenient, still serves as a good basis for this franchise. One of the larger issues with this film, from the point when Petrie and Marta switch occurs, is the continuity. After the group finds Kharis' tomb, they are disheartened to find a male mummy, as I mentioned, but Petrie is going to study whatever they find anyways, and so will Steve. Marta and Sylvani say they are going to bed, and Ali, the last of the native helpers sticking around, only does so to inform the others that he cannot stay. Then Andoheb feeds Kharis 9 tana leaves to kill Petrie, and I should briefly interject. The High Priest explains that 3 keeps Kharis alive, 9 will give him movement, and any more than 9 will make him uncontrollable, each feeding corresponding to the howl of nearby jackals. And throughout these movies, the comparison to jackals or dogs and wolves will be important for Kharis' character. And the film resumes with Steve finding Petrie dead, and Kharis gone, but Sylvani entertaining Babe and Ali, with Marta eventually joining Steve in the research. The beggar hides more tana fluid to result in killing Ali and attacking Sylvani to kidnap Marta. The way that I interpret these scenes is that Steve running off to get Ali and running back, finding Petrie dead, that must be in the same night, with a missing scene where he convinced Ali to stay, and Ali staying after another day passes, where no one has heard from Petrie strains credibility. Shortly after all of this, Marta and Sylvani go to bed again. If this is all the same night, then Kharis should already be uncontrollable, which does not change much, but is a very strange decision for Andoheb to have made and requires additional context. But if it is a different night, that also requires more context as to why nobody checked on Petrie for that long. From here, we get into the tense scenes of Tom Tyler's mummy hunting for his Tana leaves and coming into conflict with our characters. I think the mummy's tomb leverages Kharis' slow, violent prowling better and more consistently, but this film is again a start to unveiling this character and what he can do. Tom Tyler's eyes are better emphasized than his hands, so the title is confusing. Unless the title is supposed to be about Andoheb in a figurative way, since audience expectations after the very dynamic Imhotep would probably be for the high priest to serve the mummy as a right hand. Or perhaps to represent that the mummy's limbs are being stimulated by the Tana leaves and not his mind. There are a lot of interpretations, but I think the mummy's tomb ironically would have been the better title for this film, because that's where they are. They don't go to the mummy's tomb in the mummy's tomb. Steve and Babe realize the truth of the tomb's layout from the lay priest medallion of the beggar, because he is, I guess, a lay priest. It's kind of an abrupt thing, but he was helping at Andoheb, so whatever. They take different paths to get to the Temple of Karnak. Steve's path gets the mummy following him, while Babe shoots Andoheb, because the latter erroneously believed he could still manipulate a wary Babe that's already endured all his tricks. Andoheb had tied up Marta to turn them immortal, and a confrontation occurs between Steve and Kharis, where the film thankfully does not give Steve the knowledge of the audience, since he actually needs the other characters to help him. Steve destroys the Tana vial, but does not think to overturn the urn of the fluid, necessitating Babe's shooting skills once more. Kharis goes for the spilt fluid, and Steve sets him on fire, seemingly just trying to knock the mummy out with a torch holder. Kind of a funny visual there. Steve is a leading man, the stronger of the two, but he doesn't have perfect moments, necessarily. After a quick bit in which Marta passes out, Babe comments on that and passes out himself. All that is left is the happy ending where Steve, Marta, Babe, and Solovani are reunited, and Marta prevents Steve from buying another vase to go into another adventure. Conclusion. All in all, this film is very enjoyable and a strong start for this saga. I noticed new flaws, new merits upon this rewatch that would make my rating a bit more nuanced than before. This film is better as the first chapter than as the entire story. That's the most succinct way I can put it. A strong basis with room for improvement. And in a moment we shall see if later installments keep the momentum going. Hi, I'm Joe Thompson, and here we are continuing to go through the Universal Kharis films. As I mentioned in the previous chapter here, I view The Mummy's Tomb as a proto-slasher film. So, the history of slasher films is long and storied, and there are a lot of potential influences with more supporting evidence than The Mummy's Tomb. From giallo films to 10 Little Indians by Agatha Christie, and Alfred Hitchcock's various filmography. Slasher films have a large variety of distinctive tropes, not all of which appear in any given film. Consequently, classifying slasher films by any given goal or any specific trope I consider unwise. What they really are is an efficient format or a very simple formula. Because of how they changed between the 70s and now, one has to admit a degree of flexibility, and so, pending better arguments from more knowledgeable people, I have to conclude that The Mummy's Tomb, a film where former human-turned-monster Kharis returns to get revenge on the people that previously wronged him, stalking them one by one with a new generation caught in the crossfire, and Kharis' MO receiving great focus in the thrilling fight to survive, is more a slasher film than not. Just listen to George Zucco's Andoheb, who survived the previous movie, all of a sudden, instructing his successor in the ways of the High Priest of Karnak. Kharis still lives for the moment he will carry death and destruction. Ellipsis, to all those who dared violate, ellipsis, the tomb of Ananka. That moment has now arrived. Between Kharis' hunts, Andoheb's successor Mehmet, I had it right the first time, Bey, played by Turin Bey, also graces us frequently with sinister monologues about their revenge mission, the motif of Kharis responding to the moon, and the temptation that the girlfriend of John Banning turns out to be for Bey in their atmospheric lair, a cemetery. Consequently, I feel that the most flattering way to view this film is as a proto-slasher, where the film's strengths generally come from how it uses that formula, and where its weaknesses might have been mitigated by little else than sticking closer to it. The film begins with a stock footage segment recapping the previous film through a 30 years older Steve Banning entertaining his son John, as well as guest Isabel Evans, Elise Knox, and Mrs. Evans. Stock footage is a tool in filmmaking just like any other, but it can be done well, or it can be done poorly. Recently I've mentioned how a couple of the Showa Gamera movies use stock footage poorly or very well. Gamera vs. Virus uses stock footage for its major action and incidentally to break up the pacing and flow. It does not help that the film in color switches to black and white for a few minutes as a result of this. But more importantly, it is there for obligatory destruction and has no greater context. See my Gamera vs. Virus review. Follow the links and you'll see it eventually. Contrast this with Gamera vs. Giron, which did just about the best job one could hope for in smoothing over Gamera's moral inconsistencies by taking the key scenes from Noriaki Yuasa's previous 3 Gamera films and ignoring the one he did not direct, to tell a story of Gamera's increasing heroism, a transformative way to use that previous footage. And that's in my Jungian analysis of Gamera vs. Giron, which you can follow some links to find. The Mummy's Tomb is somewhere in the middle of those two. As you know, in the previous film, Steve Banning and Babe, looking for Ananka's tomb, found a male mummy controlled by Endoheb that eventually kidnapped Marta. Babe, surname now Hansen rather than Jensen for some reason, kind of weird, killed Endoheb, and Steve destroyed the mummy. Well, it is a rather rough and bare bones previously on segment that still somehow takes up a good deal of the film's first act. The reveal of Marta's death saves this from being an empty scene because it is the linchpin for Steve's character in this film, slight as he is. Steve had the victory that we saw, and its natural consequence of a loving family, nice house, and good public standing, but he has also lost a lot as Marta is now dead. And he is no longer archaeologizing, if that's adventuring in archaeology. When he reflects on the previous film's adventure, he regrets that he could not retrieve Kharis 2 for study, but he finds some solace that at least he destroyed a terrible monster. When that monster does track him down as its first victim in the film, Steve won't fight back, or at least can't. It cuts away to leave much of the strangulation up to the imagination, but a later victim of the same general age puts up a very good fight. Our dashing hero Steve not only fails to put up a good fight, but he's lost the love of his life, doesn't do archaeology anymore, and does spend his life comically arguing with his sister while telling that same old story to his son and guests that doesn't even turn out to be completely true because he didn't destroy the monster. A strangely pathetic spin on the hero of old. The Evans find the story fantastic, but do not immediately voice doubts, and the story would proceed the same whether or not Isobel and her mother believe him. It is John that contrasts his father, as Steve believes archaeology is different from the medical sciences his son works in. There is nothing intrinsic to the slasher genre that means a film must contrast the generations and let old heroes die with the next generation finding different ways to survive. It does happen a lot, however, mostly due to the fact that slashers cost the cast a slashing. That is to say that major and minor characters have to die for the tension to really hold in the scenes that threaten other major and minor characters. And it makes more sense to kill the old than the new because there's the engagement you already have with the old characters. In that regard, this is a facet in which the film starts off strong, but also could have a lot of things differently to better explore these themes in ways that I'll get to. The stock footage segment works to explore only one character, Steve. The city of Mapleton, Massachusetts may as well be just the confines of his house in the opening scenes, and John may as well just be the reward at the end of a very long arc for Steve. Other slasher movies are more efficient in both the setup of multiple characters around them and world building of the setting around those characters. Later plot points will logically follow from the idea that this is a very small and close-knit town. But the film really should have introduced that idea better and sooner. Scream 1996 is a good example of a slasher that subtly but specifically sets up at the beginning the way that the small town setting will enable certain plot points throughout the film. Small town and remote things in that film for the tension of certain set pieces. That said, our reintroduction to John following Stephen Bay's intro scenes is him playing checkers with his father in a way that highlights their differences, so the film was on the right track with parts of this. From Steve's death onward, focus is split between John and Bay, which puts us at a greater distance from the former and uncomfortably close to the latter. After John attends a medical examination of Steve's body and the weird gray marks on his neck, mold, the film tells us through his Aunt Jane's dialogue, rather than showing us, that he has been neglecting his practice and girlfriend Isabel trying to play detective. Isabel pulls up and they go on a date, but it turns out this only happened so that Bay could see them and develop an infatuation with Isabel that he tries to resist. This being one significant moment where either this is a very small town or this movie is very contrived. John's romance and investigation will weave in and out of this film while Bay struggles with and ultimately embraces his attraction to Isabel. Bay actually contrasts Ando-Heb interestingly insofar as the night-by-night murders make Bay seem more responsible in administering safe amounts of tanna leaves, not exceeding the 9 per night. As I mentioned earlier, Bay connects Kharis to the moon consistently during the monologues, which helped me to realize that the motif of howling wolves was supposed to pertain to that. Coming off the previous film, which implied the howls of the jackals were announcing it was time to feed Kharis, wolves howl continuously in the movie while Kharis is on the hunt after receiving his tanna leaves. I think this was done to make Kharis seem more monstrous for two reasons. For one thing, this film was made and seems to think it is set in 1942, starring Lon Chaney Jr., not Tom Tyler, as the mummy. So the comparison to the Wolfman that also emphasized its bloody killer's connection to the moon is not only fair, but probably something Universal would consider. Also, it works that way in the film itself. By the end, Bay, trying to justify a sinful immortal marriage with Isabel Evans to Kharis, goes on about how Kharis is immortal and not really human at all anymore, mainly because of these observed patterns. Kharis proves him some strange mixture of right and wrong, and we'll get to that soon. Any interpretation outside of the moon thing with these wolves becomes strange because wolves are not exactly jackals and also not exactly dogs, so it doesn't make sense that wolves and jackals would both be aligned to the Egyptian gods. But Steve's dogs King and Silver would be hostile to Kharis, and as I mentioned, it develops throughout these movies. I have thoughts on what the mummy's ghost later implies about the connection to dogs, which you will see when we get to the next chapter. Kharis incidentally attacks the Bannings' helper Jim on his way to kill Aunt Jane. The film says Kharis' mold marks were found on his neck, but all we see happen is that Jim passes out in fear and Kharis accidentally kicks his head. And Babe Hansen visits John, having heard of Steve's death. Babe's role in this film is very interesting, especially considering how weak of a character Steve is now. Babe essentially takes on the role of main survivor / mentor for the next generation, similar to other legacy character returns in slasher sequels such as Nancy Thompson's return in Nightmare on Elm Street 3, or Sidney Prescott in Scream 5. And this is really interesting because Babe wasn't the final boy at the mummy's hand. But now, for whatever reason, he is the only one that knows what is going on, with some idea of how to stop it. I wish more of the film was about Babe trying to guide John into surviving this ordeal, because Wallace Ford demonstrated a lot of range in this role, and his dynamic with John Banning, was unique from his dynamic with Dick Foran. Unfortunately, John doesn't take the newly serious Babe seriously. And neither does the sheriff, who gets a fair bit of screen time, but I'm not going to focus on the sheriff at all, resulting in Babe spilling his guts in a bar to New York journalist Jake Lovell, overheard by Mehmet Bey. Again, this has to be a small town, otherwise Bey is far too lucky to stumble upon the main characters, as often as he does while being a reclusive cemetery caretaker. Unfortunately, Kharis successfully kills Babe, even though he puts up a good fight. And it is John finding a piece of the mummy's wrapping and new character Professor Norman analyzing it that proves Babe was right, but too late for Babe. Babe seems to understand that the curse on entering the mummy's tomb doesn't just affect Petrie, but also the survivors and their family, and the film technically agrees with him since John is the only one to survive of that lineage, and wasn't present for it the first time, though Jane dies, also innocent of any tomb raiding. This is another reason I would have liked more time spent on Babe here, not just for unraveling this strange morality, but also because I want to know when he figured that out, and if that or his earlier general buffoonery kept him from starting his own family, as he did not. Bay once again happened to notice John and Isabel's quickening courtship. At least his obsession gives him a motivation to find them this time, so it doesn't have to be a contrivance. As John is basically being drafted into the military but insists on taking Isabel along as his bride. It's an interesting parallel that she is thrilled when John decides they are going to be married without her input, but is horrified when Bay does the same, so Bay resolves to kidnap her and turn her immortal. Bay gives his spiel about Kharis lacking humanity, and I got the sense from Chaney's performance that Kharis is rather defiant throughout that speech, which becomes obvious when Kharis almost kills Bay because of how this whole situation played out when Endoheb tried it. Interestingly, Kharis does not strangle Bay and follows his instructions perfectly for the rest of the film. This moment has created the potential momentum for Kharis to become independent, though, and we will somewhat return to that thread later in the series because this series is about Kharis and the different efforts to stop him, the different campaigns to stop him, one could say. While all this was happening, John, the sheriff, and a man named Nick Lansford, who has been working with the sheriff, again, just subplot, don't worry about it, incite a mob against the mummy, and an old man just so happens to have interacted with Bay well enough to know he fits the profile of the perpetrator. Again, this is forgivable in a small town scenario, but the film has not confirmed that it is one, and the next film will imply it's a larger town, so. Then John learns of Isabel's kidnapping, and Bay makes two mistakes in rapid succession. He elects to have Isabel drink the ton of fluid first, and then puts the fluid down once he hears the mob coming, rather than have her drink it anyways, and then go to meet them. Because of this, it is now possible for Isabel to be saved, and possible for Bay to be killed, both of which happen. It comes off as somewhat strange for debatable protagonist Bay to die before the big set piece against Kharis in the Flaming House, in roughly the same manner as Endoheb in the previous film, who had far less focus. While Kharis' characterization will receive more focus in later films, I think a more interesting ending would be where Bay gets far enough into the ceremony to turn himself immortal, and Kharis, as alluded to by wanting to strangle Bay earlier, goes rogue, leading to the mob, Kharis and Bay all having a stake in the climax. That's just an optional. That's what I think would work. It might not have. What we have works fine enough. In any case, after Bay is shot, Kharis slips off with Isabel, arriving at a house that is implicitly the Banning house. Since Kharis knows where it is, Kharis is comfortable enough climbing the side. He did so earlier to kill Steve, and it is actually strange with hindsight that he knew Steve would be up there. And John is able to outmaneuver the mummy in this house. The mob is carrying torches, and John's ineffectual fighting against the mummy sets the staircase and almost John's own head on fire once he is knocked out. It is a minor thing, but I do appreciate both Steve in the last film and John here creating the circumstances to burn Kharis mostly accidentally. However, John does catch on to the fire's presence rather than trying to use a torch holder as a bludgeon. The Flaming House is a really interesting setting for this final fight that seems pretty in line with the common slasher trope of killing off the marketable villain in more elaborate and amped up ways, fully intending to somehow bring them back in the following film. Slasher sequels as a formula tend to have more logistical errors than just the original in isolation, and I think it is significant that unlike the previous film where the archaeology malpractice of Steve was the most unrealistic part, from this point on, the hardest plot point to swallow will be how Kharis still exists in the time and space he does at any given moment. John and two other men, presumably the sheriff and Nick, all help in making sure the innocent escape while Kharis remains in the burning house. The film ends with the entire town celebrating John and Isabel's marriage, one more evidence point for it being a small town, and the film not actually being too contrived in that regard, though again it should have done more to spell it out in the later film. As far as my investment in the marriage, their relationship was fine, but I already mentioned how the split focus between John and Bay allowed me to understand Bay better, so this just seems like an obligatory happy ending, not uncommon for Universal, but also not necessarily uncommon for slashers, though there's equally as many sad ending slashers. Anyway, the final shot on my DVD, at least the DVD that I have here, is an ad for war bonds, confirming that the film at least intends to exist as 1942 media, whether or not it is also set then. The references in the film to a conflict on the same level of World War II, if not World War II itself, serves as an interesting time capsule, since the attitude of the film where John is leaving Mapleton to leave the war effort is a good thing, definitely represents the preferred attitude then. But if the film is supposed to be set in the 1970s, then it also represents the ideal patriotic attitude even in the far speculative future. Conclusion for this movie: this film has more small issues than its predecessor, which had fewer issues but each of larger severity. Which one is better depends largely on the way your perception and scale for appraising quality. I said that The Mummy's Hand works better as a chapter 1 than the full story, and I regard this film similarly, where it pays off Steve and Babe's characters while teasing the future of the franchise with Kharis' reticence to obey Bay. Well, we are here. I said last chapter, that The Mummy's Tomb would fit better as a title for the first film, and I also think that The Mummy's Hand describes this one better, since it is that hand that kills our returning heroes with the tomb nowhere to be seen. That's a good encapsulation of how I view this series. Very interesting ideas and execution that could have been truly spectacular if just a few things were shuffled around. And we'll get to The Mummy's Ghost, and then finally The Mummy's Curse very soon. Just keep watching. Hi, and welcome back to Plan9Crunch, same video. Joe Thompson here, and we are making progress on the Universal Kharis films. Having argued the previous films in the series, I am now in somewhat of a dilemma, since I do not think either fits The Mummy's Ghost, but that raises more questions as to why this series stopped those specific types of experimentation. It could be as simple as new director Reginald Liborg having different sensibilities, or that he expected to make a comedy and was saddled with the script, or that he had troubled with some of the actors, especially Lon Chaney Jr., that would limit his creativity. Regardless, I am confident that this film is unlike its predecessors, mostly due to its presentation. The opening of this film is not a call to sinister avenging so much as essentially a job interview for John Carradine's Yusuf Bey to join the still busy Arkham cult to retrieve Kharis and Ananka, juxtaposed with a Kharis cat juxtaposed with a college class, where Professor Norman explains the last film's events in ways that would affect my previous review. First, he confirms that the flaming house was Banning's, which was easy enough to ascertain via clues, but is good to have confirmation of. And second, he says that hundreds of people saw Kharis, which would imply that the town and mob were bigger than we saw. Which, as I kept bringing up, makes that film far more contrived, scene by scene, if Mapleton is anything larger than a very small town. Andoheb summarizes events a little differently than before, explicitly connecting the failed love of Kharis and Ananka to the temptations Andoheb and Mehmet Bey already fell to, which lays the groundwork for Kharis to be treated as a dynamic character and not as a slasher villain, because he's in the same conflict as Andoheb and Mehmet Bey. In this juxtaposition, Andoheb and Norman are also set up as mentor foils for young Tom Hervey and Yusuf Bey, the wise old men with different perspectives on the events. Professor Norman from the last movie, I should say. Most importantly, Yusuf's task isn't to mete out revenge, but just to retrieve Kharis and Ananka. The conflict between Yusuf, Tom, and Kharis being that Ananka might not be as dead as we have been led to believe, despite also being a corpse in the museum. You'll see, it's complicated. So, if the film has some setup of Yusuf securing resources and authority to venture deep into America and raid Ananka's museum tomb to bring her back, while Tom learns the history from a mentor with different goals for keeping Ananka there, similar to the previous High Priest brief scenes of instructing Andoheb in the first film, is this film just a morality-swapped version of the adventure that was The Mummy's Hand? Not exactly. Well, Kharis' violence was only shown off at the end of The Mummy's Hand on account of him being near dead for most of it, also being near dead at the start of this film, I might add. Kharis gets an attack in on Professor Norman very soon into this movie. He was brewing 9 tana leaves for reasons I'll get to later. The scene isn't shot with the same creativity or suspense as any of Kharis' earlier scenes. While Kharis' action of "kill where I find the tana leaves" dates back to Andoheb's instructions in the mummy's hand, the focus of the scene is actually on the mystery of what is going on with Amina Mansouri, Tom's Egyptian girlfriend, who is compelled to follow Kharis and begins to age rapidly whenever she sees the mummy. A far cry from anything in that first Kharis film. There is also not enough context to suggest that Yusuf could reasonably see the Mapleton College crew the same way Steve saw the priest of Karnak. Since outside of Norman's obsession with tana leaf study getting in the way of his wife asking him to go back to bed, of which Andoheb would most likely approve given his monologue about romantic attachment being forbidden, there is not nearly enough done to actually compare the college and the cult of Arkham. That is completely fine because you would not come to the conclusion of them being similar without overthinking this remarkably simple and straightforward film. As the quote at the beginning of this part of the review says, this movie is very efficient, trimming any of the fat that might skew it in any other direction than just quintessential Universal B horror movie. So let's get into the actual review. Robert Lowry as Tom Hervey and Ramsey Ames as Amina Mansouri lead this film as the third major pair of lovers in the tetralogy, but they are actually very refreshing and possibly the best couple so far. Tom Hervey is a man of action like Steve, that won't hesitate to jump into action for his girl, but also has enough of John's clinical perceptiveness to not jump to conclusions, and to be able to accurately take in stimuli as it occurs, but not enough of John's scientific nature to fully forget his girlfriend and get absorbed into study. Most of Tom's smartest moments are being able to understand and console Amina. Amina, meanwhile, is naturally a bubbly and intelligent woman that keeps Tom on his toes with shared banter, but harbors some mysterious secret that not even she seems to fully understand about Egypt and Kharis. I wonder if she might be connected to Ananka. We'll see. The town somewhat stigmatizes Amina through Tom's college friend and possible roommate, urging Tom to tactlessly press her on any question related to Egypt, and the town and a newspaper clipping sensationalizing the fact that she, an Egyptian woman, might be involved in a mummy crime, but Tom genuinely loves her and wants to know about Egypt because of her, rather than everyone else wanting to know more about her because of her connection to Egypt. The film mines this relationship for effective drama as we watch Tom try to salvage his relationship with the confused but still reciprocating Amina from circumstances neither one can control or understand. Still set in Mapleton, this story interestingly has new leads but keeps the townsfolk, or at least the idea of the townsfolk, consistent. As aforementioned, Professor Norman returns after analyzing Kharis' raps in the previous film, and Mrs. Martha Evans is now a more significant character of the husband Ben, and now the owner of Banning's dog King, who along with Tom's dog Peanuts is a very small dog. Peanuts is a very small dog. Once again, hostile to Kharis. King gets to be one of the only characters to survive an actual fight with Kharis. Well, Ben is not so lucky. Professor Norman repeats some version of the Steve plus Babe role in Tomb, where he is the main authority figure that gets murdered very quickly, but he actually takes us to some interesting places in terms of figuring out the overall morality of this series. As I mentioned, he becomes obsessed with the tana leaves and their purported life extension. Only academically, though, to the point of extensive test and study, even choosing to study them over his wife, and that gets him killed by Kharis because he had finally cracked the code that it was 9 tana leaves required during the full moon to give immortality. Norman will say that it only works during the full moon, which it won't be after the night of his murder, but the film proceeds with all of Yusuf's later Kharis tana feeding successfully, likely indicating that Yusuf's prayers to Amun-Ra directly impact this process in lieu of the moon. Yusuf's prayers, despite being very successful, do not actually seem to work to control Kharis, who carries out his own agenda of seeking food and having one last fight with the Banning King on the way to his summons from Yusuf. It is unclear whether or not Norman revived Kharis by melting his 9 tana leaves, in which case Kharis was lying dormant, which has not been established as an ability, or if Kharis was subsisting somehow on his own. Andoheb does say that Kharis will never die because he has to protect Ananka eternally, which takes us back to some interesting possibilities, because it raises the question why the high priest keep feeding him the tana leaves if he can live years burnt all over without them. I see 2 options. One is that this is an extension of the pattern I noticed where Andoheb and all the priests of Arkham are very irresponsible with the amount they give Kharis, and he only needed the initial dose to become immortal. Going along with this, Norman's scientific grounding explains his surprise that 9 Tana leaves were required. He implicitly has never tried burning that much because he clearly values this near-extinct resource more than the priests do. So we have finally identified another part of what makes the Arkham priests unsustainable. The first being how treating relationships as taboo makes each of them more allured by the prospect. The other option is very interesting and uses some of the previous canon symbolism. Is it possible, based on how Mehmet at least dehumanized Kharis and Andoheb ordered him around, that the priests of Arkham actually have been treating Kharis as a dog, essentially giving him treats intermittently, so he'll not only stick with them for more, but also do tricks for them? Kharis learned over the course of the films wanting to kill Mehmet Bey for making Andoheb the same mistake, and in this film, Kharis has the most independence he has had after fending for himself. So the tragedy here is that Kharis is not actually a lapdog. He's the untamed wolf, the jackal, because they are the ones that sing for him. Dogs, of which there have been 2 significant ones in this film, hate Kharis because he is being treated as one, but does not naturally have their loyalty, since opposing the cult is what led to his curse in the first place. Tom's mistaken guess as to why Peanuts is barking at one point is that he heard another dog barking and had to respond. So the film, even if jokingly, supports this interpretation of Kharis as a dog. Obviously, there are other ways to describe Kharis' journey from guardian to avenger to frustrated lover, but I have always had trouble fully articulating how the priests of Arkham can have the literal gods of this universe on their side yet also be so misguided, and this possible illusion explains some of that. Kharis is a very active character in ways that I think are designed to go over the audience's head upon a first viewing, so that the surprise of his opposition to Yusuf can still occur. Once we break it down, Kharis primarily goes to Norman to feed and then finds Yusuf also to feed, which technically demonstrates a lack of independence, except that there is implicitly some years since the previous movie, during which time he has been fine. And it does not make sense at this point that he would choose not to take his favorite food when offered it. Chaney's performance is somewhat muted by virtue of the heavier makeup to simulate being in the much larger house fire. It baffles me that the one thing Universal always seems to take into account with continuity is that directly after a fire, the monster should look more burnt, but everything else, including character names, is up for revision. It's a miracle that Carlos Braddock Frankenstein performance happened to be better than his original one. Hot take, because it is a very easy way for Universal to shoot themselves in the foot, as this film shows. However, it becomes clear based on the one limb Chaney can use to express himself that in his scenes with Yusuf, all he cares about is the Tana fluid or Ananka tomb that he is directly grasping at. Yusuf happens to have the food he likes and a plan that will get him closer to Ananka. That is why he goes with them. Yusuf doesn't order Kharis around the same way the previous masters did, and that should also indicate that things are different this time. When Ananka turns out to be reincarnated, rather than in the museum, Kharis has a tantrum and meltdown that only stops when Yusuf promises they can still find Ananka. Again, Yusuf noticeably does not order Kharis to kill the Night Watchman, because Kharis is thinking, not following orders. That will become important in Yusuf's final moments. After this point, discussion with another Egyptologist, Dr. Ayad, from the museum, convinces law enforcement that they should replicate Norman's experiment to lure Kharis there and trap him in a hole, while Tom resolves to take Amina to his people in New York. The framing of his people is interesting, because one of Amina's main worries is that she will not be accepted due to being Egyptian, since the sheriff is making a very big deal of her connection to this crime, that at least the characters involved think he wouldn't if she weren't Egyptian, and Tom assures her that his family is already planning to accept her as a bride. She is concerned and reticent, but Tom's wit and romance are enough to comfort her. Their kiss is broken off as it begins, an effective symbol for their relationship as a whole. Tom consistently pronounces the dog's name Peanuts without the proper enunciation and declares Peanuts to be her bodyguard for the night before they leave for New York. Yusuf, following prayers to Amun-Ra, does order Kharis to find Ananka, but Kharis does not leave until Yusuf tells him how. He's a thinking creature now. Meanwhile, Dr. Ayad figures out the 9 Tana leaves bit with help from Mrs. Norman. Previous films implied 3-leaf fluid was only administered to a sleeping Kharis to keep his heart beating, so I see no issue here that any less than 9 would not register in experiments. And Dr. Ayad's conduct in his experiment shows off a failing of Norman's, and that Norman did this experiment without any help or safety, consumed by his obsession, while Ayad carries this out the scientific way. The rational and scientifically minded John and Ayad are the characters these films think we should aspire to be. Kharis starts to kidnap Amina, and Ananka is compelled to walk over to him and pass out while Peanuts follows. Tom also tries to find them after Mrs. Blake alerts him. She also finds the sheriff complicating the inspector's plan that was involving the entire town at this point. Peanuts guides Tom to the hiding place of Kharis and Yusuf over a slow amount of time. The tension in this film isn't slow-moving Kharis, but the slow-moving people trying to rescue his love from him. Interestingly, it seems that Kharis chooses to bring Ananka back instead of going after the Tana fluid. As Yusuf is supposed to kill Amina, some disembodied voice tempts him to make her immortal and live with her forever. Though I have speculation on the importance of this plot point, I do not necessarily like it because it implies the predatory actions of Andoheb, Mehmet, and Yusuf may not be of their own volition. But the film and Kharis' story needed the otherwise asexual Yusuf to gain this attraction, so it might as well happen this way. Amina turns older before Yusuf's eyes, convincing him to give her Tana leaf juice. Kharis is very unhappy about this and attacks Yusuf, and here we see actual orders from Yusuf that fail. For the first time, someone checks the body of a murdered priest of Arkham. As Tom does not have the context that both the Mummy and John Carradine are bad guys, we should remember that whatever voice reached Yusuf, most likely a god, wanted Amina restored to youth and to live eternally. With Tom knocked out by Kharis, Peanuts alerts the mob to Kharis' location. Kharis, holding Amina, incidentally outmaneuvers the entire mob by climbing down the layer as they climb up, or maybe he just is that intelligent, but Peanuts is persistent, and if they're going to have a dog be this important into the story, my speculation on the symbolism of dogs versus wolves in Kharis' story is important since Peanuts and King never once betray their masters. Amina starts to age even more rapidly in Kharis' arms, and I must also speculate that, because her tomb's inscription mentioned she would have a second chance, not definite forgiveness from the gods, the very abrupt temptation of Yusuf was that chance for her to live again, since otherwise she would ultimately age too fast and die again in Kharis' presence. The mob chases Kharis into a swamp where he and a very ancient-looking Ananka sink, presumably to their shared final resting place. Everyone leaves the swamp except Peanuts, who sits and waits for Amina. This is a rather dark ending, especially for this series, and that is probably the most unique part of this film from any other Universal B horror movie. It brings to mind the ending of House of Frankenstein, where a similar scenario played out, except there, villain protagonist Dr. Neiman absolutely deserved his fate to sink in the bog. Here, every main character is helpless, either dead, in the case of Yusuf, who has stopped billing, desiccated and possibly dead, Amina, unable to stop Kharis or bring themselves to stay by the swamp, Tom, or unable to stop Kharis and bring themselves to leave the swamp, Peanuts, except for Kharis, whose agency is the reason we are here in the situation in the first place. This ending has some good suspense because we are close enough to Kharis to understand possible reasons he chose this, but not close enough to pin down the specific meaning, so that upon a first watch, this climax could have reasonably gone in a lot of different directions. And a conclusion bit, The Mummy's Ghost is a really stupid title for this movie, since unlike the Ghost of Frankenstein, we do not see said ghost, but I suppose there are options for what it could mean, each of which touching upon a different theme of the film. When Kharis finds the corpse of Princess Ananka, he touches it, and it disintegrates while Amina wakes up in bed. Obviously, Amina is Ananka, brought back to life by the power of the gods, and she is as much a mummy as Kharis is. It is her ghost that stimulates her to become uncomfortable once it resurfaces, the ghost that is tied to Kharis. However, I just said that she is as much a mummy as Kharis, a statement that goes both ways. This film is largely about Kharis gaining more independence, and he is the main character in the scene where Ananka's body disintegrates, as well as several other scenes. The events of this story stimulate Kharis' dormant and repressed ghost that initially rebelled against the celibacy of the cult, which has now controlled him for 3,000 years. It is frustrating, but I think speaks to the thought that went into the film, that this incredibly stupid title actually fits its own film the best so far in the Kharis saga. As I argued that The Mummy's Hand and The Mummy's Tomb should have swapped titles. If we are speaking in terms of creativity, I would say The Mummy's Hand might be the best, and for ambition, The Mummy's Tomb seems to have trailblazed slasher storytelling. But in terms of containing the least issues and most consistent product, The Mummy's Ghost is that. Again, this all depends most on how each of us views movies and how we appraise their quality, what flaws we notice, and what merits we think counterbalance them. My analysis here is by no means the final word in this tetralogy. Within or outside of Plan9Crunch, we all have different takeaways and may the best argumentation win. Due to the finality of not only this film's ending, but also of Kharis' character arc and the Kharis and Ananka story, I almost wonder if this should have been more of a trilogy. For all of its flaws, it's a far more cohesive trilogy than the Brendan Fraser Mummy films, and Griffin J. and Henry Suker, joined by Brenda Weisberg for this one, would not return to write The Mummy's Curse, nor would Reginald LeBourg return to direct. However, we cannot end this story here. since The Mummy's Curse did come out pretty much immediately after this film, in the same year of 1944, and it actually does end Kharis' story.
Welcome to Plan9Crunch, where now we are finishing the Kharis series. Coming off the last film, Kharis and Ananka sunk in a bog, and our legacy heroes were either gone or powerless to keep.
All right. I'm sorry, guys. The bit went on to... I'm Joe Gibson. I'm Joe Gibson, and I'm back to finish the series off. Please forgive the intermittent changes and replacements of costuming, set decorating, and even performer. In my head, this is quite clever and apt. By this point in the Kharis Tetralogy, there is no substantial creative figure I can find that was still in the franchise that had been previously. Each film had a different director, but writer Griffin J. and producer Ben Pivar were the constants before this, but now Bernard Schubert has taken over writing arrangements based on a story from Leon Abrams and Dwight V. Babcock, which sounds like a bad court case, while Oliver Drake is the producer. There is really no single piece of this creative experience that was present from the early days of The Mummy's hand, so I thought, why not make my review match that in some way? It was kind of dumb, but thank you for bearing with me if you're here this long still. It brings to mind the thought paradox of the ship of Theseus. If every piece of the whole has been swapped out, is it even the same ship anymore, and at what point did it change? This is still a Kharis film with Ananka and the evil, mysterious high priests, but Kharis isn't Tom Tyler, Ananka isn't Ramsey Ames, and not only are the priests called Arkham and not Karnak, since the third movie, but Andoheb, our main tether to this cult, is now also gone. The setting also rather bizarrely is different now. Just as abruptly as Babe Jensen became Babe Hansen. That's why I had to become Joe Thompson. It was a bit, never mind. Some of these changes happened gradually, with tethers to the old still present, but ripping off the Band-Aid with how different this film is, even from the last one, raises a certain question. Is this still the same series anymore? I would say yes. But you'll have to be in suspense as to my reasoning for a little bit. Despite also starting this review differently than before of this chapter of this review, I like Kharis, I'm still here, for better or for worse, and this review is built on my previous analyses of the series in the sequence, just like this movie is built on the previous escapades. This film is set in Roar, Louisiana, so somehow Kharis, Peanuts, Tom and the Mob in the last movie all made the 1,382-mile trek from Massachusetts to Louisiana during that climactic chase scene, and opens at Tante Berthe's cafe with a musical number from Tante Berthe. Character Cajun Joe hits on her and seems somewhat like a sleazeball, but one they put up with. Well, another character named Akili alludes to Kharis being around as a town legend after winding up in the swamp 25 years before. So as the one overarching constant, the timeline of these movies is always confusing. Is this set in the 40s, 70s, or 90s? Unclear. The actual plot begins when the Southern Engineering Company, represented through belligerent Pat Walsh, Betty's uncle, aims to drain the swamp that contains Kharis, much to everyone else's chagrin on account of a recent disappearance and murder attributed to the mummy or to a Rougarou Lougarou. Two doctors from the Scripps Museum, which previously housed Ananka, Ilzor, and James Halsey, show up to reclaim Kharis and Ananka from the swamp. Ilzor, it turns out, is to reclaim them not for the museum, but for the cult. Now, there has been at the very least a 25-year time skip, and seemingly Ilzor and another character already planted in Louisiana town called Ragheb, this is Martin Kozlik's character, are all that remain of the cult of Arkham. It makes enough sense given how Andoheb sent the beggar, Mehmet Bey, and Yusuf Bey into dangerous scenarios that got them killed, that Andoheb might have run this cult into the ground off screen, even if that is a little contrived. But I will actually commend the detail that Ilzor was planted in the museum. As far as damage control following Dr. Ayat figuring out the secret of the tunnel leaves, it makes sense for the cult to infiltrate their enemies. As for how Andoheb would know about that, the mummy's ghost showed both him and Yusuf to be very adept at interpreting information from the gods in prayer. It just feels like there is a movie missing, perhaps, where a dying Andoheb sent Ilzor as their last hope to revive Kharis and annihilate anyone who knows their secret, and where Kharis somehow wound up in Louisiana. Ilzor at least has learned from Yusuf's mistake of trying to outright control Kharis by trying to reason with him mostly. This brings us to the obligatory backstory explanation with stock footage where Ilzor instructs Rogheb in their Tana ritual, and the caretaker of the monastery where they are keeping Kharis arrives only for Kharis to kill him. Ilzor informs Kharis that he will have to find Ananka, and throughout these scenes, the Tana leaves are once again confusing. 3 to keep Kharis alive is mentioned again, though he would have spent 25 years without any, so does he even need them for his heart to beat anymore? But there is a scene where an already moving Kharis is given 9 Tana leaves. 9 are supposed to give him motivation and movement, but consistently he has already been moving to receive those 9, so he should be uncontrollable in all the films, which he admittedly is in these last 2, but for character reasons, not Tana reasons. And so now we get into the return and recasting of Princess Ananka. Yay. Next, a hand and later a body emerge from dirt nearby the swamp. This being walks stiffly, like a mummy, from being caked in mud, but the sunlight above empowers her to walk normally after she washes off. This is Virginia Christine's Princess Ananka. Now, this hardly feels like the same character as Ramsey Ames in the previous film, and that is technically both a good and bad thing. Amina was trapped between 2 battling identities, and the amnesia here should serve as a reset for at least one of those. If last time the spirit of Ananka inhabited the normally witty Amina, this time the amnesiac Princess Ananka should be our true introduction to this character, as she uncovers at least one of her dominant personalities. In this movie, she alternates between a bubbly and helpful nature that is knowledgeable about Egyptology, or almost full catatonia, where all she can do is mutter Kharis, run from the mummy, and pass out. It is in her less lucid moments that Cajun Joe finds her, tells her he can take her to find help, goes through the side door of Tante Bertha's cafe, lays her on the bed, and surprisingly actually does go get Tante Bertha for help, leaving to get the doctor once Tante Bertha starts helping Ananka. I don't want to allude too much to R-rated subject matter, but this scene, especially with the context of Cajun Joe as a bit of a lecherous ne'er-do-well, resembles a particular kind of heinous assault, especially with Ananka being groggy. Implicitly, the moonlight and Arkham magic have a drug-like effect on her to achieve this state, and I will applaud the film for subverting this imagery to henceforth establish Cajun Joe as a very strong and moral character. It actually contextualizes why the beginning of this movie is structured so we start in Tante Bertha's with him, and not with the remaining priests of Arkham as per usual. We have already seen the mummy and the priests, but there is still suspense to be had in establishing the dynamics of these new townsfolk. Next, Kharis finds her and kills Tante Bertha, the fleeing Ananka, winding up with Halsey, Betty, and Dr. Cooper. But before I get into that, I would like to finish discussing Ananka as a character. As I mentioned, her catatonic and absent-minded moments tend to correspond either to nighttime, a good plot justification for setting the action during the scarier nighttime, or odd circumstances involving Arkham priests that said priests take credit for. Her mind goes blank when she sees Ilzor during the next day, and he claims he was trying to lure her back to Kharis in that moment. During the day, specifically when the sun is up, she shows greater humanity, as she's an agreeable and knowledgeable person that can help Halsey out by identifying and dating Kharis' raps. Because the rappings were different in Menophis' era than after, apparently. The film treats this like Ananka surfacing, but Ananka would only know the Menophis rappings and would not be able to compare across the centuries, right? We've never seen any Arkham cultists talk about the specifications of the rappings. It is Amina that associated closely with Egyptologist Professor Norman and checked out books from the college. That said, it is possible that Ananka, however long her spirit was in the Scripps Museum, may have observed figures like Steve Banning or Dr. Ayad in their studies, but if she can't remember either earthly existence, why would she remember her ghostly one? The scenes of Kharis chasing her and their dueling motifs make for very interesting cinema to analyze. She is at her strongest in the sun, but still cannot remember herself, or ultimately escape her fate of being recaptured and magically mummified. And Kharis is at his strongest during the moonlight, but is a slow-moving slave to his tragic pursuit of love. There are moments where Ananka or the people protecting her are right in his grasp, but they move on without even noticing he was there. Moments like that work well for tension because we have already seen his sheer power and brutal effectiveness, but it also communicates a pathetic tragedy otherwise called The Mummy's Curse, the title of the movie. He's almost more of a ghost than a man, and very much out of focus in this film by comparison to the last, while still carrying out his will where it intersects with the priests, though still also a downgrade in autonomy, more of this curse of the mummy. The focus of this chase scene is on Ananka. Engulfed in almost total darkness, an effectively scary scene because we, like Ananka, cannot see much of anything, and do not know the layout, but Kharis is still out there, far closer than we realize. When she ends up with Halsey and Betty, they step into more important roles and each survive confrontations with Rogheb and Kharis, respectively, while all Kharis gets is a few more kills, an only somewhat frustrating climactic choice, and finally to be buried and eventually put on display at the Scripps Museum. Leading up to the climax, Kharis kills Dr. Cooper and destroys Betty's tent to abduct Ananka. While Cajun Joe helps out in a search party for Ananka, Rogheb leads Betty into a trap, and Halsey follows Kharis to find Rogheb killing Ilzor, because Rogheb rather abruptly wants to take on Betty as a sinful bride. Kharis can really only play the role of predator here. Cheney really isn't given a chance to act much opposite Ananka, but his murders are fine. I dislike that he ends up killing Cajun Joe for how much I appreciate the character, but Joe wasn't really the lead of this ensemble, just the character who did the most for others, so his death means more than that of Akili, the bartender, or Gooby would. Didn't mention Gooby. These movies are a little bit dated in some aspects. Anyway, the climax. Once these remaining core characters are all at the monastery, Rogheb and Halsey fight, and first, I will just say this might be the most obligatory final fight between a designated protagonist and designated antagonist of any of these classic Universal Monsters films. Halsey and Ilzor had a connection, and Halsey grew suspicious of Ilzor briefly when he was trying to lure Ananka to Kharis, but this finale can proceed as if those scenes did not happen, a very bizarre choice. Rather than flowing from a movie's worth of build-up, Halsey and Rogheb are fighting because of only the most recent plot points, which is still logical, just not cathartic. I hope that makes sense. It didn't really build outside of what happened 2 steps ago, when there's an entire journey, an entire flow, an entire path to most climaxes in this movie. The more important part of the sequence is when Kharis turns on Rogheb, and again, it makes sense in the context, but does not have much foreshadowing. I like the idea that Kharis is so fed up with these priests failing that he'll kill them when they fall to temptation, even when their temptation isn't Ananka. And I also kind of like the idea that Kharis will be out of focus for most of this movie as part of the tragedy of his character, but I don't think the film's execution in weaving these plot threads together is exceptionally good. Rogheb has no chance from the moment Kharis goes after him, meaning this ending is entirely reliant on the spectacle of the monastery falling around them, which is admittedly well done. It is just also strange for Kharis to single out Rogheb when Rogheb is the only person there that isn't trying to take Ananka and Kharis back to the museum. That's Halsey's whole reason for being there, and Ilzor should have told Kharis that. Well, the Newman reveals that Betty also plans to go with Halsey there. Making Ilzor the one to go after Betty would already make the climax more personal for Halsey because the film decided for some reason that Halsey's the lead instead of Cajun Joe, but it would also work for Kharis since Rogheb was only being instructed on how to care for Kharis by Ilzor, and it was Ilzor that demanded far less of and seemed more helpful to Kharis than any previous master. For Kharis to lose that at the same time as Ananka, who he barely interacts with in this climax, and had to fight his way out would be very interesting. What we have is serviceable, because Kharis still does lose the most benevolent and powerful master he's ever had, but I think it is undeniable that it would have been more interesting for Ilzor to be the final foe, based on the same reason it was the most interesting for Edelman to be the final foe in House of Dracula. It inserts an extra layer of tragedy, while also engineering a scenario where our hero monster is the underdog. Imagine for a moment a polished version of the Mummy's Curse where Ilzor, as in the film, very carefully navigates his cult's calling with satiating Kharis, feeding Kharis, and trying to help him find Ananka while using his magic only on Ananka for that goal until he does yield his temptations and then does it to fight Kharis. The fight between an Arkham cultist at full power and Kharis, technically the weakest he's ever been in the series, but the most motivated, not only carries proper tension for a finale, and is based on the natural momentum of the story of the series, but is also the kind of fight I would expect to lead to a destroyed monastery, Ananka somehow becoming mummified, and all the Tana leaves nearby being destroyed. As is, those just kind of happen. With the shallow justification, this is the final film. It doesn't feel like the final film. It doesn't even really feel like a Kharis film. I don't want to spend too much time here pitching a different film, because that isn't really film criticism. But unless I am missing some important symbolism, the filmmakers choosing this ending over any other possibilities really weakens the foundations of this story and makes it seem less interesting. Do you, the reader, still remember or care as much about the tense Cajun Joseph version now that the film has decided that he, our introductory character, is not important enough to have a stake in the climax? If I hadn't brought up the differing styles of Ilzor to previous High Priest, would you remember that when the final image the director Leslie Goodwin chose to show us was Kharis' turn and Ragheb after the latter's temptation was more abrupt than use of bays, which itself required an act of God? These are rhetorical questions. You can answer in the comment if you like, but a conclusion, if any of these films qualifies as a cash grab, it would be The Mummy's Curse. If any of these films would benefit the most from polishing, additional drafts, and a longer runtime, it would be this one. And that is saying a lot, since that's true of all the Kharis movies. And as I've already mentioned, this film is the odd one out, the Ship of Theseus, but it still does enough interesting things with the mythology of Kharis and Ananka. The sun and moon contrast is very simple, but also really interesting, and the tragedy of both have a place in the series. I hope you enjoyed this Plan9Crunch review of the four Kharis films. If you did, you can read this and other reviews on our blog, Plan9Crunch.com. You can also follow us on Facebook and TikTok, and even subscribe here. Despite some statements in this video to the contrary, I am still Joe Gibson, and that's a wrap.